You're listening to Dirty Feet, a podcast from No More Radio.
Vous écoutez le podcast Dirty Feet sur les ondes de No More Radio.
Hosted by,
Animé par
Allison Burns,
JD Papillon,
et Stéphanie Morin-Robert.
Stay tuned.
We're gonna move you.
So last week's episode was pretty exciting, pretty feisty, pretty fiery. We had some ladies on from Studio 303 to talk about Cabaret Tolé, which was their event slash cocktail slash auction slash protest slash show happening at Sala Rosa this weekend. And we had a ball. JD and I ended up hanging out at the show and the dance party afterwards. I had a good time. Did you have a good time?
I had a really good time. The performances were really fun. They were very political. They were very outspoken. And they were really varied also. It didn't touch on just one subject. It touched on a lot of subjects which people feel the Harper government is sort of not being very good about. And no, it was interesting to have something as overtly political happening in Montreal because, as I mentioned during the interview last week, we don't see that much happening now in Montreal. And it was quite a bit of fresh air, I feel.
Mm-hmm. Well, Miriam said, you know, this is not going to stop us from making art. It's just going to fuel something new. And I definitely felt that. And like you said, you know, it opened a can of worms for everyone to come forth, that people who had a problem with the way that the government is treating different minority groups, and the charter was discussed, and funding, of course, for arts and for culture and for a lot of services. So it was really a fiery evening of like-minded liberal people.
Yeah, if you weren't liberal, I guess you wouldn't have felt at home in the audience. But what's interesting, though, is that there was this sense of needing that community because of what the Harper government's been doing, because of how many people have been suffering under that new government, that current government, I should say, and how the only way we can survive this is by grouping up together and supporting each other. And it's something that I feel is really needed, personally.
Well, it was nice to see the numbers, to see how many people were on board with this kind of attitude and this kind of discontent with current government. And of course, the take home was go vote. We've got a couple of years to figure out your registration, but go vote.
As Alexia O'Hara said herself while she was hosting, if you don't vote, it's a vote for the Conservative government. So please go vote.
Yeah.
Dirty Feet's getting political.
Woo, woo, woo. So now on to our interview today. In the studio today, we have Rosy Simas, who is joining us from Minneapolis. She's in Montreal to teach a workshop that she did over the weekend, and to present a work, We Wait in the Darkness, that she has been working on in residency at the MAI, the Montréal Arts Interculturels, here in the city. And she's joining us to speak to us about a variety of projects that she's participated in and started, and also about this work, of course, that you can catch at the MAI from the 6th to the 8th of this month. Perhaps we can start with talking about, Rosy, where you come from. You're from the States?
Yes, I live in Minneapolis, which is a part of the Twin Cities, Minneapolis-St. Paul in Minnesota. My family is from Cattaraugus, New York, which is our reservation. There are 3 Seneca reservations in New York. And I was not born there, though, and I didn't live there. My mother is a journalist, has been a journalist for 50 years. And so I spent early years in Washington, D.C. during sort of the height of Native American politics beginning in the 70s. And then we moved to Minneapolis, which was really the center of where American Indian activism was happening outside of San Francisco.
Okay, and it sounds like today your work is focused on your Seneca heritage and and your ancestry and whatnot.
Yeah, the piece that I'm working on now in particular is based on the matrilineal line of my family, and it uses some sort of my grandmother's life as a map to move through the piece. My work, solo work, is primarily improvisational. So it's a very long, not very long, it's a 40-minute structure of dance and film and music.
And you've been working in this field for 20 years. You've created 30 original works at this point, 10 of which are evening-length dance works. Maybe back to the beginning, what made you choose dance as your form of expression?
I think I sort of, it happened by default. I went to theater school as a high school, full-time theater school, so academics in the morning and theater in the evening, and that was my intent, was to go into theater. I moved to New York City when I was 18 and took private acting lessons and was going down that route. And then I decided actually to give it all up and go to college for science. And as a way to help my grade point average, I decided to go take some dance classes because I had already had years and years of dance, and I thought, this would be easy. This will help me. And I sort of got sucked right into the dance department, and then that was it.
And you've studied native dance, ballet, modern, Klein technique, contact improvisation, Butoh. How involved are you in all these different forms? Do you have a focus, a main concentration?
Yes, I would have to say that it's probably somatics at this point, but also I teach what's called body reeducation, which is based in Klein technique. So my teacher is Barbara Mahler. She's been my teacher for 25 years. Susan Klein was also my teacher there in New York. They've actually taught here a few times through Circuit and 303. So that's the work that I teach. And then I've done a program which was based in body-mind centering for 3 years. And so my work has a lot of somatic influence, but I've also trained in a lot of other things. So when native dance is not actually a training, it's just I grew up doing powwow dancing. So that would have been my earliest form of dance that I worked with. But since I went to theater school, I studied ballet and modern and jazz and improvisation.
And how much do you feel that powwow dancing has influenced your learning and your education in the more formalized kind of dances? Do you feel that there's always an aspect of that which stayed with you when you were learning more?
I would say not directly. What there is there's an influence of my childhood and my growing up. I grew up in an urban native environment, so I went to a survival school for a couple years. Those were schools that were started by native communities, and so they were focused on language and teaching from the culture. And I participated in ceremonies a lot of cultural activities. And so I feel like as a whole, it influences who I am and how I move. But trying to make a direct link to like one particular thing, like dancing at powwows, it's not that specific. You can't draw like such a straight line. I don't ever like catch myself doing that on stage or anything like that. But I think it has a different type of influence.
And this is not your first time in Montreal. Perhaps you can let us know when our listeners may have seen your work before in this city.
I presented a show at 303 in 2008. I brought my friend Deborah Jinseth, who's a choreographer in Minneapolis, and a dancer that I'd worked with there, Jennifer Mack, to come here, invited them here, and we shared an evening of work, and we worked with, I worked with Gordon Allen, who goes by Elwood Epps, and Michel F. Cote, and we did some improvisational work together, and I was interested in that exchange between artists from different places. I also worked with 5 dancers from Montreal at that time, but I was living here. My friends moved here in 2000, and so I came to visit every year because it used to be really inexpensive to come up here. and started going to workshops and participating in dance classes and going to the jam. I really love the contact jam here on Sundays. And so it would be like my dance vacation. And then I came up here in 2007, and I just decided that I would stay for a while and see how it went, and I stayed for 2 years.
And you were telling us a bit before the recording about a sort of parallel between Montreal and Minneapolis as a dance scene. Could you tell us a bit more about how you perceive that exactly, like how you feel that those two cities do have a bit of a shared maybe idea or energy about their dance scenes?
Well, I think part of it actually just has to do with funding and support. So in the Twin Cities, Minneapolis, St. Paul, and in Minnesota in general, we have actually quite a bit of arts funding. We're probably the most liberal state in the U.S., and that has something to do with it. And Montreal also is very supported. I mean, so is Toronto and Vancouver, but this is the place that I've experienced the most in dance. And so there is a lot going on in dance itself. A lot of range of new work and young choreographers and older choreographers and classes and workshops and opportunities. And so I thought that I saw a lot of similarity in the energy built around dance and the arts in general. And there are very significant differences as well, just because of the cultures are different. And yet we are so close in the proximity. It's a 2-hour flight. It's a 20-hour drive. That may seem like a long ways to some people, but it's really not that far when you're going from one culture to another in terms of like two different countries and that kind of thing.
And when it comes to like creativity-wise, do you feel that the subjects, the themes being explored by dance artists in both cities, do you feel that there is a bit of a similarity? Do you feel that there is a bit of a connection or a sharedness there?
I think there is, and yet I've had conversations with people from here. I think the training is actually can be quite different. And that's part of why I think the sort of cross-pollination is very interesting. Where there is a similarity is just that there is a lot of variety of work going on in both places. And I don't think that you could say that if you went to, not to put any of these cities down in the U.S., but like dance in St. Louis or dance in Kansas City, Missouri, or other places. There's just not as much going on, and even somewhat in California, and part of it has to do with that they just don't have as much support.
On that note, you actually mentioned on your own Laura Kramer a little earlier, because of course, setting up this interview, my mind went to that and the idea that she works with themes of Native Americans in her work as a choreographer here in Montreal. And you're doing, I mean, she's from out west, but she's still Canadian, and you're an American coming from a similar perspective. Can you speak at all to that, your relationship with her or your contrast?
Well, it's interesting because you remember I told you that I did a show here in 2008. Well, I auditioned people, and Laura was one of the people that was in my piece. And I actually didn't know that she was First Nations. I don't think she ever told me, which is kind of fascinating. And not that came up, but that's actually how I met her. And so I stayed in touch with those people that were in the piece, and Laura told me about something that she was doing. And so when I developed the Échange project, Laura was the first person that I contacted, and she was actually the only one that I invited. Everybody else was selected through a application submission process, because I was particularly interested in supporting choreographers who are First Nations or Native or Alaskan Native who were interested in contemporary dance. And even just 3 years ago, this was more of a rarer thing. In the U.S., it's much more rare than it is here. And that, I think, has to do with our funding systems.
That they're less supportive of First Nations artists?
No, we don't have the same kind of funding structure. It has to do, your social structure is very different. You know, it's like there's a lot more government support I know even though you're struggling now with all of the things that are going on, but we don't have that kind of support in the U.S. So much of it is really through foundations and individual giving. Our crowdfunding, I don't know if people even do much of that here, but our crowdfunding is a Kickstarter, and these other places are huge and hugely important in supporting the arts in the U.S. because of the lack of funding in different places. And there wasn't any particular funding nationally until just maybe 4 or 5 years ago for Native artists who were doing contemporary work. There's always been small pockets of funding for Native artists who are doing traditional work. So if there isn't a way to support that, then it doesn't really grow. So there are maybe like 5 or 6 pretty well-known national choreographers, but as a whole, I mean, for the whole U.S., that's not very many. And so I am very interested in being able to support the germination of that happening more.
On that note, perhaps you can describe to us a bit your Échange Montréal Twin Cities exchange program. And did you start that program?
I did. It's only happened once, and I can't even say I don't know if it will happen again. It really needs a large funder and some presenters behind it to happen. So I sort of did it as an independent artist. I raised $10,000 was all I had. And we did a production where we brought 2 choreographers from here and 2 dancers from here. And the 2 choreographers made work on Minneapolis-St. Paul dancers. So Sasha Kleinplatz came in and she made a brand new work on dancers. And then Georges Nicolas Tremblay came in and he remounted a work that he had already done on dancers there. And then I came to Montreal and I brought 1 dancer with me. And we created a trio with 2 dancers here. And then the 2 dancers from here came to Minneapolis and we worked more and then presented the work. And as well, there were other Minneapolis-St. Paul choreographers who presented work in that show, because originally the idea was that we would get a presenter here interested in the whole package. So the Minneapolis choreographers and the Montreal choreographers, and present the échange here. But we weren't able to make that aspect of it happen. Our production was highly successful. We had 5 shows. Almost all of them were sold out, which for Minneapolis is actually quite good. It's different than it is here. Like here you go and there's like the audience is full most of the time. In Minneapolis, it's a little more of a struggle. The consulate from Canada came to the show. There were all kinds of different people that came to the show that loved it. They loved the variety of the work. The dancers had that were participated with the Montreal choreographers really enjoyed their experience, which was different than any experience they had working with a choreographer. Soon after that, the McKnight Foundation in Minneapolis, they have an international fellow, and so they brought George Stamos right after this happened. And so what was great about that is the échange generated energy to help people get excited about George being in Minneapolis. So we had, even though our project was really just the little first part in January, having George there twice and then through the summer sort of created a lot of energy and interest in dance work from Montreal in the Twin Cities.
And what kind of difficulties did you encounter trying to find a presenter in Montreal who would be either willing or have time under table to show that complete package?
Well, I think first of all, it probably has to do with that I don't speak French and I don't write in French. And so in contacting people, I was really limited by people I already knew. And then I think that, like I said before, our systems sort of work differently. I think curators want to curate, And so sort of putting together a whole package and trying to sell that as is, already curated in a sense, even though it was done sort of juried panel, maybe that the way that we had it set up was not as interesting. So I think that a funder has to get behind it. Like the NEFA National Dance Project in the U.S., which is a big presenter. They're funding my current tour. They have a project called Fused, which is a France and U.S. exchange. And so a French presenter can apply to bring an American choreographer, or an American venue can apply to bring a French presenter. And with them, what I found out from that project is that mostly it's American venues applying to bring French artists. So I think also, even though that's France and this is Quebec, I think also there's maybe not quite enough understanding that there's an audience here for that work. And I think the same may be true also in France, that they just don't quite know whether or not there's an audience there for U.S. choreographers, I should say, not American. And I'm hoping that can begin to change, because I think from all the people that I know in dance here that are choreographers and dancers and people who go to the Contact Jam and all of that, I think that they would be very interested. So I don't know what that is, but that seems to be a piece of it, just seems to be interest.
There is quite a bit of a lack of understanding and knowledge of the American scene amongst the Montreal community, dance community. And we feel that it's really difficult to know and to hear about what's happening in the States, especially on the independent level, because so few American companies are either invited or get to come present works in Montreal. Do you have any ideas how this could be solved? Like how we could have this exchange even with the distance, or hear more about what's happening? Like there's on the boards in I don't remember in Seattle that's been bringing like recently they just presented Fred Gravel's work, so there is a bit more of an exchange happening, but it's still very rare to see American companies bringing Montreal companies or vice versa. How can we hear a bit more about what's happening? Like dance is very much about the performance on stage, so there's not as much visual archival documents that can be shared. Like quite often it's not like cinema where, you know, there are good videos being produced and people can just find that. It's very much about the stage performance aspect of it. Is there like a way through the internet, let's say, that people could hear a bit more about what's happening elsewhere?
Well, I think there used to be through Facebook, but with all the filters, it's quite difficult. It's funny because I was walking down the streets with my friends last night and I said, I think I should have a Facebook in Montreal, because I never get to hear about what my friends here are doing anymore. It's all filtered out because my location is Minneapolis, Minnesota. And I think that's one thing that sort of doesn't work for us anymore, that did actually used to work for us. I don't really know. I mean, I think part of it is just structure. I mean, I hate to say this, and maybe this is just not correct, but I think for a long time, the U.S. has had a really bad rap of everything U.S. is bad. And I don't mean art. I mean just sort of in general, you know? And I think that's really changed. And so and also I think part of it is how we exchange with presenters. So, you know, presenters are invited to come up here and see work, but probably there's not a lot of inviting presenters to the U.S. to things like our Arts Midwest Conference. APAP, I was just there. I know that there were some presenters there from Canada and the Canadian Council. I talked to a few people. But I think that maybe that exchange in general is not happening. I know that Miriam and Dina were invited by Ben Johnson, who was working at Northrop in the Twin Cities, and he started something called the Minnesota dance platform, which only happened once because he went to LA. But he had actually a similar vision. He used to get invited up here a lot, and he really loved the dance scene here, which is part of how George Stamos became the McKnight Fellow. And so I think he saw a lot of benefit in that exchange. And I think it takes individual people. Like you said before we were talking on the air, that Montreal people tend to know a lot about what's going on in New York, but not outside of that. And so like for me, I've only even presented a 10-minute piece in New York once, and that was just last year, and I'll do another 15-minute piece this year. But there's a lot going on, and I'm just giving that example because I've been making work for 20 years. There's a lot going on that isn't taking place in New York. New York actually has sort of lost a lot of their funding. More dancers there are working for free than probably anywhere else. There's still a lot going on, and it's still a vibrant scene, but it isn't the center of dance in the U.S. Not that there is one, but there are a lot of other places, Chicago and San Francisco and L.A. and other places where there's a lot going on. And so I don't know the answer to your question, but I think maybe even just like our conversation and like the échange and getting to know people, that ideas will start to come up and things will start to happen. When I was talking with George Stamos this summer about the échange, I think one thing that became very clear, and with Sasha and George Nikla, is that if this is going to happen, it's going to be artist-driven. It's not probably going to be presenter-driven, because of that element that I talked about that curatorial element. What we're interested in is supporting each other and each other's work, regardless of whether or not we love it, even. Because the échange is about ideas, it's about experience, it's about learning how other people make work. It doesn't have to be like, oh, I love your choreography, so I want you to come and do this. It's more about, like I said, understanding and learning new things, learning new ways to do things. And I don't know that presenters, I don't think that's their thing. That's really an artist exchange. And so we'd have to have a presenter that would understand the benefit of that, or a funder that would understand the benefit of that without having to construct it in a way that then becomes not useful. So I think that's how that could happen. How do we hear about each other's work? I don't know.
And when it comes to within the U.S., how does it work for you? Have you gotten to tour your work a bit? Have you gotten to show it in different cities? Like, what's the structure there for touring artists, or not big companies like the Cunningham Company or, Paul Taylor or anything like that?
Well, I haven't had the opportunity to tour a lot. This actually is a very big year for me. We have a couple of the NIFA National Dance Project, and then the National Presenters Network. So those are the two sort of national touring programs that we have. So people who want to tour apply to get funding to support the tour. And then with the one that I'm doing, there's a pool of money that's like a savings account for my work. And the presenter can apply that's interested to have half of the cost covered by this savings account of money. And so that encourages presenters to present the work of, but it's small, so like my pool, which is a national pool, I think there were 18 artists selected, everyone ranging from me, who would be in that, even though I've been around for 20 years, I would be an emerging artist on that scale, to Trisha Brown. There are other ways to do it. There were small programs. There was one called Scuba. There was Seattle, Chicago, Minneapolis, like a little tour network. Or one can apply to be in a showcase or a festival. So those kinds of things. But I've actually, I presented in Vancouver and Montreal, and I've had a little more luck in Canada. but I think that has to do with the nature of my recent work. So it's definitely challenging to get work seen elsewhere. One has to really devote oneself to just doing that.
And do you feel in any way that the fact that you're First Nations, the fact that your work deals with First Nations issues has helped this transition over to Canada?
Yes, because the subject matter of my new work, actually, I think that's what ignited a little more interest in my work in general. And I didn't do it for that reason. And so I actually was a little surprised when I got a national award, and actually 2, and then got supported for this tour. But it's been a great opportunity for me because it's allowed me to meet a lot of other contemporary Native artists. So we say Native in the U.S. and you say First Nations here. And so the first place that I presented in Vancouver was the Talking Stick Festival. And so that's where we're going back to at the end of this month as well. And with the May, I presented to do this particular work. And I think that's part of what interested them.
And going back to this work that you'll be presenting this week, We Wait in the Darkness at the May, you mentioned that it was about the matrilineal history, and which is interesting because Laura Kramer's work, to go back to her recently, Native Girl Syndrome, was also about this, about the history of her grandmother when her grandmother moved to a larger city. Why were you attracted to this subject matter at this point in your life for this specific work?
It actually had to do with last April, I got the flu, and I was going through some old pictures, and I had inquired with my mother about one in particular, which is actually in the production at the May, and was asking her questions about who certain people were, and she actually didn't know. And I found it very surprising because the Seneca are matrilineal. We get our clan and our family identity through the female line. And we know a lot about my grandfather's side of the family and can trace it back very far. But on my mother's side, there was just all of these questions. So I had the flu and I was literally at home, couldn't do anything for over 2 weeks. So I did a lot of genealogy research, and I started to reach out to different people, family that would be distant relatives, actually just even looking up people by their last name. And so I started to dive into these stories. I asked my mom a lot of stories about my grandmother and anything she knew about my great-grandmother, and started to follow these oral histories and piece them together with facts. And that's how it got started. And I solved a genealogy mystery that no one else in my family had solved, which was really quite fun. And it started taking me back to our home reservation in Cattaraugus. We actually have family from Cattaraugus and Allegheny, and then my grandmother was born on Corn Planter, which actually is submerged underneath the Allegheny Reservoir. And I went back maybe 8 times in a year. Also, my uncle died, so I was going back, and he was 94 during that time period. And that's how that started. I wanted to find that history, that family history for my family and for my mother. And so the piece is being made by film that was taken at Cattaraugus and Allegheny, and the Allegheny Reservoir that covers the Corn Planter Reservation that my grandmother was born at. All of the sound is created from sound clips that were taken at those places. We also recorded some Seneca speakers while we were there, women. And so the piece is small improv structures within a larger one, and each one deals with sort of a different event or in my grandmother's life. So I use her life as a map in a way to sort of navigate through the structure. And I didn't know her very well. There's quite a big age difference between my mom had me when she was 30 and my grandmother had my mother when she was 30. So there was a pretty large age difference between us, and she was living in San Francisco when I was young, so I didn't get to know her very well.
You mentioned earlier that your work is very much about somatics. And how does it feel to trace back your lineage, trace back your blood history to some extent, through the body directly rather than through the oral tradition?
Well, there's a few things that I'm working with in particular. So for the last few years, I have really sourced my work from working with systems of the body. So for instance, a different piece that I did that was about women in the Afghan and Iraq war started out with a duet called Bonding and Defending, and we worked particularly with sourcing material from the bones that in somatic work are considered protective. So that type of thing. So I've been doing that for quite a while. So in a way, it's very easy for me to translate something in particular to a somatic experience because I have a lot of knowledge about how that works. In particular, I'm interested in cellular memory and lately also DNA scars. So there's been some recent scientific studies that show that things that happen to our grandparents, particularly on the matrilineal side, are on our DNA as scars, and that we can actually reverse that damage by the things that we do in our own life, meditation or movement or, focusing on being well, those kinds of things. And then we can not pass those scars on. And so I've been playing a little bit just with the concept of if time goes forward and backwards and it's not just some linear thing, then the work that I do can also remove those scars for my grandmother, my great-grandmother, that kind of thing. So reversing it in time. It's just a concept. So part of the work is like one structure in particular is a short dance that's about removing a memory that my grandmother had that was quite traumatic. When she was 6 years old, her grandfather killed her father in front of her, and it was her earliest memory. So that's sort of that kind of thing.
As First Nations, one of the things that I, from an outsider's perspective, feel is that quite often the power structures tend to try to erase First Nations history and to sort of paint over, quite a lot of the things that happened in our history, in our shared history. Do you feel that this is something as an artist that you have to do over or bring back up so that it stays in common consciousness?
I wouldn't say that I feel that I have to do that, but I would also say that there is a part of this piece that does bring up a historical event that happened. I am very much focused on the idea of a healing. My work isn't political. There isn't how one views it is their own, how they view it, right? Their own experience as an audience member. But I don't have an agenda with it. I'm more interested in how the concepts of traditional and contemporary. So in my culture, things that we think of as traditional, so oral history, stories, songs, those things are always passed down through memorization. And the purpose of that is so that they are affected by the people who are speaking them, singing them. And so, of course, everything that is contemporary affects these things that we think of as traditional. And for me, being a contemporary artist is also being a traditional artist. I'm interested in blurring that line as we see it. And what I think that does is it helps dispel some of the stereotypes that we think of, not only non-Native people or non-First Nations people, but First Nations and Native people themselves. Because we ourselves have adopted stereotypes, how we identify each other as Native or First Nations can be based on things that are not even a part of our culture, but have been passed to us from another culture. So my interest is more in that than it is in politics or history.
But to some extent, wouldn't you feel that that process of healing that you're talking about is inherently political to some extent?
Probably.
So in a way, like, I mean, of course, like when it comes to creating political works of art, it's very much a touchy subject because, you know, there's the notion of what is political, what's not. Basically, what I'm trying to say at this moment, if I'm sure myself of what I'm trying to say, is that do you feel that there is a lack of an outward social context, like of really putting aside just this like art for art's sake, but really focusing on the community and the effect that the art can have on those seeing it and watching it and surrounded by it?
I think that there is a not so clear division between the two. As a choreographer, I don't want to be dictated that my work must do a certain set of things. And so I still want it to remain in the art for art's sake category. But the subject matter that I choose is going to come from a part of who I am and my beliefs. And they're pretty strong in terms of, you know, how I grew up and what I think is important, and what I resist is creating work which separates me from the people who are in the audience. And so I'm more interested in bringing them into a world than I am in dictating to them. And part of that, probably that resistance, has to do with that I grew up around the American Indian movement and a lot of very preachy type of political activism. Yes. And I don't really have any interest in that. And I'm an artist. I'm not trying to make a statement which will change someone's ideas about, I am. I'm not trying to make a statement, but I'm trying to include them in something that maybe allows them to reflect and see things a little differently. But yes, I'm not interested in playing on what we call either like white guilt or any of those things. And I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with any of that kind of work. There isn't.
So there's nothing wrong with white guilt?
Well, no, not that. I'm talking about the kind of work that is more about telling the audience how it is. Presenting something about something that is political or social or historical in a way that creates an us and them. It's just, that's not what I want to do.
So We Wait in the Darkness is a self-solo that you've created, and you're collaborating with Douglas Beasley, who's doing the photography and cinematography, and Francois Richaume, who's working on the sound of the piece. And we've discussed briefly that you're incorporating clips, both sound and visual, of moments in your grandmother's life. Can you talk a bit more about the kind of the multimedia environment that you're going to be setting up and how you're using these tools in the work?
Yeah, the sound, Francois is a very hands-on involved composer. So I don't actually make the work without him. I don't get a piece of sound from him and go in the studio and rehearse without him, which is a very new process for me. So we have 4 residency times together, in which that is the time that we're actually making the work. He is also involved in the structure of the visual work, because the 3 of the elements work well together. And then basically I edit the video, or the film. Francois and Doug and I went to New York together and did sound and film on two reservations where my family live, and just to spend some time there. And we have a set which is made out of paper, and that is the surface in which the projections of the film are on.
And what would you say is the atmosphere that you create with all these tools? Is it a very somber atmosphere? Does it vary?
I don't think that it's somber. I don't want to give a lot away.
Fair enough.
It's very Francois works with quadraphonic sound. So the sound environment is meant to bring the audience and the stage all together. It feels, I think, a little otherworldly at times. It fluctuates between being very personal and the sound having a lot of space.
The May is a very intimate space and very much tailored to solo works. Is this something that you took into consideration when you started thinking of the work in that space? Did you think, this is good, like I really want to bring people in through the sound, through the movement, through that idea of a community sharedness? Or is that something that you feel was already present in the work?
Well, it's incredibly beneficial for us because this is really our first showing of this. We had a residency at a small theater in Minneapolis where we were spending the time figuring out how to build the set and how to make the lights work, and it wasn't so much a time to figure out even the structure of this piece. So yes, it's very beneficial right now for us to be in an intimate space and see how that works. The piece, however, is designed to be in 3 different kinds of spaces, and our tour includes large theaters, intimate spaces, a museum, and a gallery. So we have a residency at different spaces. Our next residency is actually at the Autry, not the Autry. The next residency is at University of California, Riverside at the Culver Center, which is a large gallery, a very large gallery, and with white walls all around and pillars and a huge dance floor. And so we will reorient the piece and the set to that. And then the next residency, we're back at the theater in Minneapolis, but the stage is actually a lot larger than the one at the May. And so we're able to use the whole stage to figure out how to present the work at a larger venue. So when we tour in the U.S., we will tour to Chicago, Los Angeles, Maui. Isn't that nice? And Montana, I'm forgetting places, Washington, D.C. We will show an excerpt at the Judson Church in New York. And we also go to Fredonia, New York, which is a college that's 10 minutes from my home reservation. So all these places are different. We actually also have a 2-week residency at a gallery in the Native community in Minneapolis. And we're doing an installation, which includes artifacts from my grandmother's life, historical maps, other visual objects, and film from the project that we're doing that will play while we're there, and we'll do little 5 to 10 minute presentations. So we have a lot of different elements that is going into this. So the May is great for us to figure out what our relationship is to the audience, which I think is one of those things that is the last thing that's thought about. And so I feel really lucky that we get a chance to sort of feel what that's like. And then we get to go into residence again, feel what it's like, go into residence again, and then premiere in the U.S. So.
And you gave us a little tidbit at the beginning there that we didn't get on record, but there's going to also be a film work showed alongside the piece that is separate from the work. Is that correct? Can you talk about that?
Yes, there's a film that Douglas Beasley and I made. It was sort of our first project together. He's a photographer, and he wanted to dabble in film. And so made a work called Threshold, which was also a performance piece, which had the same elements of sound and film integrated into the piece. The work was inspired by the writing of John O'Donohue, who is a Celtic poet and theologian. So I am interested in a wide range of things, even though I am native. I always have been. So I spent 3 years working on that in particular. And so we're going to show that. It's 13 minutes. It'll be at the top of the show. And then we'll do the solo piece.
Is that going on tour with you as well?
It's not.
Okay. Just for us.
Right. Well, because this is really the first performance and the first residency, we didn't know how long the solo was going to be. And we wanted to make sure that at least people got a 50 to hour minute experience. And we didn't want to pressure ourselves in. So we thought, let's share the film because A, we haven't had a chance to share it yet. It just came out this summer. And B, it would give us a little more flexibility in we're structuring the solo. So, but I think the two actually go very well together. And we're just sort of at the beginning of figuring out where we will submit the film to get shown at different places.
And as we mentioned a bit earlier, also you did a workshop at the May this past weekend. Can you tell us a bit what your workshop was about? Like what kind of approach you took?
The workshop was a somatic movement-based workshop. I like to do a workshop before a show in the town because I think that it gives dancers who would come to the show a actual kinesthetic experience of how I make the work. So the exercises are really based on exercises that I use to create Threshold, the film, with dancers. There were 6 dancers in that film. And then also things that I've used myself for creating this solo work. We had a great group. I think it was almost 20 people in the little theater. Yeah. And it was 3 hours and it wasn't long enough, but it was a great time.
And for those exercises, do you use a lot of the body re-education material that you teach in your weekly classes in Minneapolis?
No, actually, it's totally different. The body re-education classes are very specific. They are a method, and I hate to use the word exercises, but I don't know how else to say it, that I've learned from Barbara Mahler in New York. And the language is very particular. That's part of why there are so few people that teach it. Have to take class for a very long time, and then they sort of decide if it's good for you to teach it. So there's not really a certification program or anything like that. The workshop is very much about assisting people into getting into particular states of being so that they can access images, sensations, feelings, and also qualities of movement. And then to help them explore how that can be transferred into a short improvisation solo so that they have that experience of finding a way in somatically. I work a lot with the skin and the sense of listening and then using that as a way to start moving.
I'm very much looking forward to We Wait in the Darkness. We've been speaking with Rosy Simas from Minneapolis, and she's presenting that show at the May from February 6th, 7th, and 8th at 8 p.m. That's 2014, of course. And thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks.
Also, before you run away, we have a few tracks that you've decided to allow us to play on the podcast today to hopefully give us some sense of the work. Can you introduce to us what we're going to be playing?
Well, one is the music track from the film Threshold.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Dirty Feet is recorded every week at the Montreal Improv Theatre. Check them out at montrealimprov.com.
Dirty Feet est produit et animé par
Produced and hosted by Allison Burns,
JD Papillon,
et Stéphanie Morin-Robert.
You can find out more about our show at nomoreradio.com, follow us on Twitter at Dirty Feet, and find us on Facebook at Dirty Feet Podcast.
Vous pouvez écouter tous nos épisodes sur notre site web ou vous pouvez vous abonner également sur iTunes à notre podcast.
Listen to past episodes on website or subscribe to the podcast on iTunes.
While you're there, be sure to give us a rating and or leave a comment to help us spread the word.
Tune in next week for a whole new show.